Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us to this webinar. I think we're going to make a start now. Just before we start, just want to say, so today's webinar is provided by the Let's Face Change team, but we're also in partnership with Middlesex University and Greater Manchester Mental Health Trust. And the focus of these webinars is to think about what mental health practitioners can do about racism. So a bit of a background for Let's Face Change. So we're a company which we've grown and we've tried to encourage conversations about exploring and tackling the lack of diversity in clinical psychology and also the racial inequalities in mental health services. And these webinars are an opportunity to keep these conversations going, explore new ideas and build momentum for our conference later this year. As is with things like this, there's always a fear of getting it wrong, but we want this to be a space that honors difficult conversations and some of the feelings that come up when we have these conversations. And our philosophy is really about allowing different viewpoints and respecting those viewpoints. And we value the philosophy that there's no one right way to see the world or talk about these issues that we will be exploring today. Thanks. Over to you, Ozzy.
Yeah, thank you very much for that summary, Annie. I'll just briefly talk about the format of this webinar. So it'll be about half an hour presentation, followed by some questions from the Q&A function, and then we will open the floor up to take additional questions. We're sort of a bit late, and apologies for that, for those that were waiting. I'll introduce and give a warm welcome to our guest speaker. It's Tarek Younis. He's a lecturer at Middlesex University in psychology and also practices as a cultural psychologist. Tarek's interests include racism in mental health, Islamophobia, and the impact of culture and religion. So I'll hand you over to Tarek now for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Let's Face Change, for having me and everyone for coming on a Monday evening. Let me go ahead. First of all, can I just get a sound check? Is okay? Everyone can hear me all right? Okay, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and just take the second to share my PowerPoint, which I have somewhere. Right there. So I'm really happy to be here. As I was very graciously introduced, my name is Tarek Younis, and I've been writing and researching and talking about racism and Islamophobia, particularly from the focus of institutional racism, for a number of years. And it's important for me to also preface by saying that I'm actually only working part-time now as a senior lecturer at Middlesex University. The other part-time, I'm a racial justice researcher at this really fantastic organization called Healing Justice London, where we're looking at issues of racism, thinking about transformative health justice. And so I'm really coming with several hats on. I should mention I'm also starting today. I'm going to give myself a timer. I'm starting today with a heavy heart, I think, as many of us might be, and hoping everyone is. And in fact, I dedicate today in particular to a 6-year-old girl who's younger than my daughter, but the same age as my son, whose name is Hind. And I'll begin with her story, and not gratuitously, but because in fact her story ties in very, very directly to how we can make sense of institutional racism here in the UK, and particularly in mental health. So for those who don't know Hind's story, I'll try to summarize it with as much respect as possible. Hind was traveling with her uncle, his wife, and her 3 cousins in a vehicle that was shelled by Israel. She and her 15-year-old cousin survived the attack, and they were trapped in the vehicle. Her 15-year-old cousin, the adolescent, the hero, called the Palestinian Red Crescent, asking for them to come save them from the shelling, from the gunfire that they were hearing outside of their vehicle. The Palestinian Red Crescent contacted Israeli authorities and made it clear that they were going to go and save Hind and her cousin. In the meantime, Hind's cousin passed away. She died. And what I mean by that is that she was killed by the attack. And Hind was alone in the vehicle, waiting for someone to come save her. When the Red Crescent ambulance arrived, it too was shelled by Israel, despite the fact that they were going in agreement to save Hind. We only found out days later that Hind then also died alone and starving in a vehicle. I begin with this, again, not gratuitously, because I think we tend to fabricate and in a way almost pervert our understanding of racism from the local to the global, from the global to the local. Stuart Hall famously spoke about racism as a floating signifier. And one thing I'm going to do is outline for all of us today why Hind's story matters to us on a global level, especially for us in the global north, and especially anyone interested in mental health. And to be honest, I don't actually have to go so far to be able to explain this, because there is not that many degrees of separation between the dehumanization of Palestinians by Israel, and by Zionism in particular, and what we see and what we've seen for a very long time to be the repression and suppression of Palestinian voices across the global north. I share here an example that I'm going to come back to of Rahman Mohammadi. This was years ago now, who was referred to the PREVENT program, which I'm going to introduce. I mean, I'll just introduce it right now. PREVENT policy, as many of you might already know, is a policy put in place for mental health trusts, for schools, nurseries even, to report and identify individuals they suspect might be vulnerable to radicalization, i.e. might become terrorists in the future. And Rahman wanted to organize a fundraiser for Palestine years ago. And he was referred to the PREVENT policy. He was then spoken to alone by the police, and the police warned him not to talk about Palestine in school. And they also approached his 14-year-old brother and to pressure Rahman to tell him to stop being so radical for trying to organize around Palestine. There's a very important mental health component here that I've been blessed and privileged to be able to point out just from my experience, because one thing I didn't introduce myself as, this is really important. I'm part of a project called Coming Home, which seeks to support individuals who've experienced police violence, state violence. Here in the UK, racialized Muslims who've experienced police violence, border policing, prison violence, etc. And I can affirm to anyone listening that these interactions with the police are incredibly harmful, are incredibly distressing to degrees that are so difficult for us to capture. I mean, it's such a harrowing experience when you believe that you can you have a voice, only to have a police officer come to you and warn you not to have that voice is something that is very difficult for us to qualify. It doesn't work for us to even count it in numbers. And one Muslim adolescent told me that due to the prevent policy in schools, in fact, she's been afraid of sharing her voice for years. And again, when we're thinking about institutional racism, we have to consider the weight, the volume of silence. The volume of silence is very difficult to qualify. It's very difficult. How do we measure that? Do we measure by the lack of words that are not being expressed? It's a deep, profound anxiety that they're sharing. And so this is where we have to begin when we're talking about institutional racism. We have to understand the very process of racialization and what's happening here, especially in the UK, where a lot of discussions of racism often fall within maybe sort of generic state-defined categories of BME, which I'm not going to unpack right now. I'm going to specifically now open the door for Islamophobia and bridge it back to Palestine as well, but speak also to how that addresses Blackness and other forms of racism as well. So obviously, it goes without saying that Muslimness and Islamophobia has a long history within European imagination. Here's a picture of Salahuddin from 1240 that depicted a demon exiting his mouth as he passed away. There was a long history of racializing Muslims to monsters and outsiders, and particularly within liberal history. But the racialization of Muslims to threat, foreignness, to national security, to the integrity of nationhood in the global north is also one that has continued until today. Here's Douglas Murray's, who I hope for all of us is an infamous man. His book, The Strange Death of Europe, is a bestseller in the global north. And as scholars have noted, what the Muslims have come to represent in European imagination is in fact the death of Europe itself, which, as we know and we could see, one of the major justifications for the intense genocide that we're bearing witness to right now in Palestine also comes from this idea of representing and dehumanizing an entire population to represent our very death. How do we make sense of this now for psychology and for mental health? Is actually something that is very, very significant. And in fact, I argue, and as I write about in my book, psychology plays a far more significant role in providing a veneer for institutional racism than many other forms of logics. Okay, but let's bring it back to trying to make sense of what Malcolm X tried to distinguish between illiberal and liberal forms of racism, right? So Malcolm X, he spoke about the wolves and the foxes. The wolves are these illiberal racists, the ones that everybody in society could point to and say, oh, that person's a racist. They're often exhibiting this wholesale demonization and hatred of entire groups. They're saying all Black people are bad, all Muslims are bad, or all Jews are bad, etc. Right? So very, very clearly defined demonization of an entire group. I'm going to put some footnotes here because we still see this form of illiberal racism acceptable and increasingly acceptable, especially in settler colonial projects, but I'm putting that aside. In general, most of us could point to that and say that's something that is illiberal and unacceptable. Our problem today is not illiberal racism when we think about how racism perpetuates. When Malcolm X made that distinction between the wolf is the illiberal racist, you could see the wolf trying to attack you. It's showing its teeth, it's looking to bite you. We all could point to the wolf and say, that's the threat. the fox smiles at you, as Malcolm X is saying. He's inviting you in. He gets you comfortable, but sooner or later actually ends up biting you anyway. And this distinction between illiberal and liberal racism, which many people have made for decades, is one that's really, really central to our understanding here. Liberal racism doesn't work on the same premise, rhetorically at least, as illiberal racism. Liberal racists aren't going out saying, I hate all Blacks, I hate all Muslims. It's often working, first of all, in logics of goodness and badness. You'll find that liberal racism will operate under a logic of distinguishing between good migrants who are beneficial to our society and bad migrants who are not. Good Muslims who are working with in the war on terror, bad Muslims who are not. Actually, George Bush famously made that comment about the war on terror when he said, you're either with us or against us, right? So he's specifically speaking to Muslim nations at that point, saying you're either with us in the war on terror or you're against us, right? You're either the good Muslims or the bad Muslims. And it operates very distinctly within logics of liberal acceptability. And liberal acceptability is a way of thinking through how very racist ideas can be normalized through logics of, let's say, security, national security. We need to protect the nation, and therefore we need to look out for this and this groups, this and this people, etc. So we'll see again. There's a division being made within groups. That's then perpetuated through certain social conflicts and policies, the war on terror, gangs, knives, illegal immigration, what have you. These are all ways of trying to find this sort of distinction between the good and the bad. What's really important here is colorblindness. And colorblindness is very significant as a concept for us in institutional racism. If anyone has any interest in institutional racism, they have to make note of colorblindness. Colorblindness is a way of saying that I'm not going after Muslims, I'm going after terrorists. Or the police saying, when we're looking for gangs, we're not looking for Black people, we're looking for all gang members. Even though in London alone, if you are racialized as Black, you're 30 times more likely to be stop and search than if you're white, right? But police especially, that's been documented in the US and here in the UK, take this colorblind veneer by saying, no, we're not going after Black people, right? So nowhere in the US or here in the UK are police told, go look for Black youth. They're going to look for gangs and they're gonna, drug dealers, etc. That's the logic that they're employing. The problem is that this is highly racialized. It's a racialized social conflict, but they're erasing it by assuming a veneer, a stance of colorblindness. And psychology plays a very significant role in erasing the significance of race when it matters. So again, really important for you to follow my logic here. Groups are racialized according to dominant ideologies of particular social conflicts, right? It belongs, like, for example, nationalism. We know that nationalism, be it Britishness, German, French, right? Like that question that's, and I'm going to get to that later. Actually, I'll make the point here that Hannah Arendt famously said about World War II Germany, the nation killed the state. This idea of nationalism, who belongs to the British, who belongs to Britain in public imaginary, who belongs to Germany in public imaginary, and to Denmark, etc., is racialized to white. It's what prefaces the question, well, where are you actually from? If you're not white, we'll all often get the question, where are you actually from? So when we're saying it's a process of racialization, as you're going to hear me say, I'm saying that groups are racialized according to space and time, according to dominant ideologies and particular social conflicts, dominant ideologies like nationalism, particular social conflicts like the war on terror. So racism, and therefore obviously institutional racism, is not a virus, it's not a fringe hatred, It's not the psychologized prejudice. It's something that belongs with the social structures itself. And there's many ways in which Muslims are racialized. As I mentioned, simply for the fact that many Muslims are not white, within the dominant ideology of nationalism, increasing nationalism we're seeing across the global north, their very bodies alone precipitate that question that they're not actually from here. But obviously things like hijab and niqab, the Iraq war and other wars of Afghanistan was famously justified on the logic of liberating Muslim women from their aggressive and cultural environments. And that benefits, obviously, the logic and process of imperialism within a background of Orientalism and civilizational superiority that the West can liberate, and the West is the end of civilization, and all other populations across the world can eventually replicate the Western liberal democracy. And so the hijab and niqab has often become a battleground across the global north for quote unquote liberation. And then of course there's the war on terror, which benefits a very, very, very large military industrial complex. And we've seen that increasingly, that just being racialized as a Muslim, which could be in behavior in terms of religious practices, beards, but also just being racialized as a Muslim, even if you're not a Muslim. So we know that Sikhs, for example, get attacked on the street, right? When people ask me, well, how can Islamophobia really be a form of racism? I often give the example of two Christian Coptic Egyptians. If you don't know what a Coptic Egyptian looks like, I'm Egyptian myself, so let's pretend they look a little bit like me, which they will to an extent. And they went to join a protest against the building of a mosque in New York City. So in New York City, there was a protest against the building of a mosque. And they went to join that obviously majority white protest. And when they joined, they got their butts kicked by all the people at the demonstration. Why? Because they were racialized as Muslim, even though they don't identify as Muslim. See, the process of racialization is actually completely irrelevant how you identify yourself. And therefore, that's how we understand the floating signifier of racism within space and time, and making sense of the logics of racialization, the processes of racialization in our current climate, not as a static phenomenon. Racism is not a static phenomenon, it's a dynamic one. So when I speak about Islamophobia, I'm going to talk about the management of ideal British Muslim thoughts and behaviors, or what I would call ideal citizenry, as embedded within policies like Prevent. About in schools, they embedded fundamental British values. The only thing I really want to say, and just that you'd have to take for a given, because I don't want to take too much time to justify this, is that one thing that's very particular about Islamophobia is how Muslimness, or perceived Muslimness, even if they don't identify as Muslim, is racialized to threat in public imagination. And we notice even through empirical studies, there was one study that was done in 2018, which tried to explore where the fear of terrorism comes from. And one might assume that people are afraid of terrorist attacks the same way they might be afraid of crime, right? If someone's afraid of an attack, it might resemble maybe some sort of fear of crime. But actually, the research found that having negative attitudes towards Muslims was far more correlated with the fear of terrorism. And so those two went together much closer than the fear of crime, which lends itself then to speaking about how racism, institutional racism, then operates within mental health settings. From my research with the British Academy, I looked at how the Prevent policy operates in mental health settings. And I'm just going to give the first example just for the sake of time. I have many examples, actually many more than what I've conducted in my research, just simply because people keep on coming to me with more and more examples. But I'll do only the first one, which is about a racialized Muslim woman who wears a niqab. And she went here to the NHS for seeking therapy for trauma. And the therapist told her in the very first session that one of the signs of successful treatment for this Muslim woman's trauma is her ability to remove her niqab, her ability to remove, essentially, let's say, her headscarf. Now, that's a very powerful experience already, but let's dissect a couple of elements that are going on here. First and foremost, the therapist wasn't smiling, but we can imagine that she could be saying this with a smile, which takes away, I hope, this idea that racism is always it's always kind of associated with this notion of verbal abuse or physical abuse when we think about racism. But here, we could think about the therapist wanting to help the Muslim woman. She'll be like, look, one way we know therapy is working is that you could finally take off your niqab and your headscarf. So this idea of smiling is something for us to be able to hold on to. But now, because I've also explained a little bit of the history of how racism and the racialization of Muslims operates, we see the discourse of liberation, right? She wants to liberate the Muslim woman from what she thinks is a regressive cultural practice. And that sort of becomes naturally embedded within the mental health the mental health moment or space rather. I have other cases, such as at the bottom left, the psychiatrist who told me at length for hours of a story of a racialized white adolescent woman who converted to Islam, became a Muslim. Oh, sorry, before she became Muslim, she was experiencing intense domestic violence, and the whole mental health team was supporting her with this, and they all cared about her very much. And then suddenly she converted to Islam and she became Muslim, and suddenly the question of domestic violence became secondary to the potential fear of radicalization for this Muslim woman. And as we dissected, she was explaining how the team had to go through the prevent training, and they felt responsibilized towards a policy to act upon it. So the space itself became different according to the policies that were being embedded within the NHS. This was not something that, as I found in my research, many people want, but they felt that they felt their professional autonomy to be restricted according to the policies that are embedded within institutions. And hence, they started prioritizing the possible threat of potential radicalization over the actual existing violence that this young woman was facing at home. There's another dimension that I think is very, very important that I found in my research, which is actually very, very significant to Palestine. Again, when we think about how institutional racism operates, some people might come to me and say, and I just had this conversation, someone might come to me and say, well, I don't think I actually experienced any discrimination in my mental health setting. Not as a patient or anything, right? They'll just say, I haven't experienced any discrimination. And then I might ask them, well, how comfortable are you to share your full thoughts and feelings about Palestine? And, the vast majority of people I've asked say they're not. And then there's some research coming out. I don't want to preempt it. It's going to be coming out demonstrating that the vast majority of Muslim health professionals in the NHS are not comfortable talking about Palestine in the NHS. And if health professionals are not, we can also start considering if our patients and service users are. But I found, actually, through policies and the politics, the socio-political climate, that in one of the articles which I can share, many racialized Muslims, we were very fearful of speaking against prevent in the NHS, such as, during one prevent training, one woman, she wasn't Muslim, but she raised her hand and asked, wait, why are we going to prevent training? And someone just yelled at her, we're just trying to save lives, which brought this sort of moral dimension that if you are critical of prevent, you're against saving lives. Racialized Muslims then told me answers like, it's almost like if you're anti-prevent, you must be pro-terrorism. Or another racialized Muslim psychiatrist told me, it's just you don't feel safe, you don't feel safe, you don't feel safe, you don't feel that your colleagues wouldn't report you. And of course, I know of a very terrible case, and several cases at this point, including on Palestine, for those people who've spoken out on Palestine. In this case, it was about prevent, who were reported. And then it became a whole incredibly suffocating issue for them. So I'm going to bring it back here to 2 more slides, I hope, so I could finish within the 30 minutes that was allotted to me. So the prevent training is a great example of understanding how racism is institutionalized, how we think through the process of racism beyond bad apples. One is the psychiatrist who sent me this slide through prevent training. For all those who can't read it, it says, what factors might make a child vulnerable to radicalization? I didn't take this picture. The psychiatrist took this picture and sent it to me. He was very, very angry. And you can see the options are deprivation, bullying, attending the local mosque, adolescence. And the point of this slide, the point of prevent training here, is to not click attending the local mosque. What might make a child vulnerable to radicalization? If you click attending the local mosque, and here I ask everybody to ask yourself if this is proper anti-racist, effective anti-racist education. If you actually believed attending the local mosque and clicked it, you go to the next slide that tells you you're wrong. You're brought back to this slide to uncheck it, and then you go to the end and get your prevent certificate. But even then, that's not the point. The point is that you could see what the purpose of the slide is. The slide recognizes that the threat of radicalization and terrorism is racialized to whom? To Muslims in public consciousness. So in a way, the slide is trying to effectively raise the signifier. Is it a Muslim putting on a headscarf? No. Is it a man growing a beard? No. Is it attending the local mosque? No. But this constant process of raising and erasing a racialized signifier, in fact then reifies the centrality of how terrorism radicalization is racialized to Muslims in public consciousness. And I call that performative colorblindness. I'll come to, I think, what we're seeing happening right now, and this is where things now become very significant for us in the mental health community. In understanding these processes, whereby communities are not directly impacted by name, right? So it's not like policies are saying, go look out for Arabs or Muslims or Black youth, as I explained before, but rather it comes out from the impact. And what's happening, one thing that I think is very important for many mental health professionals to know, is that the UK was launched a covert, so not publicly known, trial of an unprecedented relationship between policing and the NHS. This relationship has never existed before historically, called these vulnerability support hubs, or as I'm going to call them, mental health hubs, which receives joint funding from police and from the NHS to funnel individuals who've been referred to prevent. And as I explained before, people can be referred to prevent for so many numbers of reasons that are highly, highly racialized. To receive a mental health assessment and to be able to be supported for their mental health, for their vulnerability, under the watchful eye of both mental health professionals and the police. And in these trials, we found that overall, racialized Muslims at least 23 times more likely to refer to a mental health hub for Islamicism than a white British individual is for far-right extremism. But I'm going to end it on this note here, because I'm over time already. But this is probably the most important point of mine, so I'm just going to take like a minute or two just to explain it. Hill Aked, who's amazing, they work at MedAct. They did a bunch of FOI requests and to look at what the police are saying about these trials of these vulnerability mental health hubs. Now, the police admit that the vast majority of people who are being referred to these mental health hubs are young Asians. So people, young Muslims, I think between like the ages of 16 or 21 or something like that, the vast majority of them. Now, what happens now when you take all these people who are being referred to prevent for potential vulnerability to extremism, for the potential of becoming terrorists or terrorists or criminals in the future, but who exhibited no sign of threat or anything in the present? What happens if we give them all a mental health diagnosis? So the police themselves, this is from the FOI document, the police themselves find that, oh, most of them, after mental health assessment, nothing comes out. Some of them have trauma. Some of them have autism, and then anxiety, depression, etc. The two bars I want to point out is the two bars that the police themselves make a very fascinating comment. Okay, this is not coming from me. This is actually coming from the author of that police document. So the police officer, he noticed that emotional and behavioral dysregulation or dysfunction is very high. And he noticed that the stress is very, very low. Now, anyone who's in mental health here knows that emotional and behavioral dysfunction or dysregulation is not a real sort of category. It kind of is just a way of speaking of like maybe broadly saying that there's something wrong with someone's emotional or behavioral configuration or, some symptoms, quote unquote, right? Anyway, the police are saying that that's strangely very high. And the police themselves admit that most likely what's happening is that many people who are distressed are being put in the category of emotional and behavioral dysfunction or dysregulation. Now, as anyone who has any exposure to critical psychology or psychiatry or anything would know, is that the jump between distress and emotional dysfunction or dysregulation is a political one. When we say people are distressed, we recognize the cause of that distress. If someone's father passes away and they're very, very angry, we're not quick to say this person has emotional dysfunction or dysregulation because we recognize the cause of distress to be legitimate. What we know very well in research then is that when someone's cause of distress is not seen as legitimate. So if they're displaying anger, a student displaying anger in class about the genocide that's happening in Gaza, and that's not their outcry of anger and sadness is seen in any way, shape, or form excessive, then that's how that point of distress becomes emotional dysfunction, which we know is happening in schools through behavioral management units, I think they're called, which we know are racist because they explicitly validate certain forms, certain causes of distress, and then localize others within the individual by saying, no, the problem is in you. It's not what's happening. And this is the depoliticizing impulse. If we think about institutional racism in mental health, one of the most powerful impulses of psychology and psychiatry, as we know historically, is this depoliticizing impulse to reduce, if not completely erase, the causes of people's experiences and localize it within themselves. So I could talk about this for a very long time, and obviously there's a lot more to say. I have a book on this, but if anyone's interested, they need. I'm not encouraging anyone to buy it. If you need a copy, I'm very happy to lend it to you. You could just send me an email, and I'm very happy to share or loan you a PDF, so to speak. But just I'm not sharing this to sell books or anything, just so you know, if anybody wants to read more on this. And that's it.
Thank you, Tarek. Very inspirational and powerful talk there. Really resonated with some of the stories and experiences of people who've come to you with their own reflections in terms of difficulty of speaking up and how that can be really challenging in the system that we work in, at least for most of us. So really want to say thank you for taking your time out this evening on a Monday evening to come and share that with us. It's really left me feeling quite moved, really powerful story at the beginning, and all the way through that webinar. It was really impactful. Thank you. Yeah, really love that. And just your generosity to share your book with other people. That was a really nice touch at the end. So thanks again. We've got a few questions. I'm going to hand over to Jen, who will sort of ask some of the questions. So actually take a bit of a pause, Tarek.
Thank you, Aziz, and thank you, Tarek. There's a few questions coming up and some reflections as well. If I could just share some of them and get your response to that, that would be really wonderful. Thank you. So someone was reflecting about how difficult it can be in the systems when a lot of colleagues and people within these very white systems that we're in completely miss that they're being racist and can be silent, for example, around issues like Palestine. And as you mentioned in your talk, sort of say that it's too hard to engage in those conversations. And then the impacts of that on racialized people to then feel the need to speak up, and the kind of the cost of that on people's own mental health. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts or response to those reflections there.
Oh, thank you very much. I don't know what just happened to the camera. I hope you can still see me. I don't know if it just like kind of zoomed in on its own. I don't even know how to fix that. Okay, that's kind of weird, but thank you very much for sharing. To answer your question, I think I just wanted to first validate that anxiety. Okay, I don't think we give enough time and space and attention to validate this. I just want you to know that I recognize that to be a very difficult and suffocating experience, and that you're certainly not alone in experiencing this. And it's something that I think many people are taking seriously. Obviously, not only including myself, but I think, again, I also think in particular about Palestine, it's not something that only affects racialized minorities and racialized Muslims and Palestinians. It's something that we've seen repercussions for anybody really who speaks out. So that's also very, very important to highlight. I think besides validating your experience, I think the point I'd like to make is that your voice matters nonetheless. Okay, and I think we tend to fall back if we think again about institutional racism, right, is one in which by de facto experience of being like, I don't feel comfortable speaking out, speaks to an environment or a political climate that's problematic, okay? So given that, there's a legitimacy then to your voice to be able to speak out in some way, shape, or form. I do, however, want to emphasize that the general strategy for us to be able to speak out in climates where we might be afraid to share our thoughts, especially for racialized minorities, is to not do it alone, right? I think this liberal, a very, very liberal sort of notion of, you know, the free flow of ideas and everybody has a democratic opinion is one that we know to be not true, but also showing quite the double standards among many different things, as we've seen with Ukraine, for example, that people can support certain populations, support certain people without repercussions, and not support others. So there, I think the only advice I want to say very quickly is that certainly I think we need to find ways and places to be able to join with others. And there are a number of places and groups and people where these sort of things are taken seriously. If you're a mental health professional, there's, for example, the UK Palestine Mental Health Group Network. There's other support spaces, such as the ones that are being established at Healing Justice London. So definitely look out for spaces where you can feel supported, where you feel part of a community, where you also recognize and learn about your rights, etc. We only mobilize and speak out in solidarity, which is really, really important. You know, generally the advice is don't speak out by yourself, but learn to speak out as one coherent voice with many others. I'm going to take the moment also just during the next question to like figure out what the camera problem is.
Okay, and just to say the camera looks fine from us looking at you, Tarek, so.
Oh, okay, good, awesome.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe sort of building on some of what you were saying there's a reflection as well about wondering if the thing that psychology and mental health might find particularly difficult is being able to see ourselves in real time and being able to see in hindsight what psychology's contribution has been to awful things, but actually in the moment not being able to kind of see or sit with that as clearly, and that's when we're being most socially violent. And so the question there is it via the illiberal racism route, or maybe our preoccupation with the intrapsychic, as opposed to the social political oppressive factors that might lead partly to that situation?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. It's probably one where I'd love to sit with for a very long time. I think there's several processes at play. I think, first of all, one glaring point that makes the psy-disciplines very particular is this depoliticizing impulse. This is something that has been recognized by Frantz Fanon, you know, the Martinique psychiatrist that wrote Wretch of the Earth, etc. For anyone who doesn't know him, certainly look him up. You know, for a long time, we recognize the impulse or the ability for mental health professionals to depoliticize by psychologizing an issue, right? We know this through colonial projects, whereby, you know, colonial subjects in their anger, in their distress under colonization, you know, I'm talking about under French colonization, British, etc. You know, psychologists were employed for what? They were employed to not only kind of like measure the anger and distress of the populations that they were colonizing, but it also employed the logic of making, you know, making the issue of their righteous anger and distress towards the process of colonization, making that anger about them, like, oh, these people are really, really angry all the time, right? These Arabs or whoever, or whoever was colonized at the time, it was a way of being able to provide this psychologized veneer that it's the problem is in them. Okay, this is something that also was reflected in the civil rights movement, whereby psychiatrists saw that the growing anger and resentment of the Black community in the United States was a relation of their own. It belonged to them. It belonged to their psychological configuration, rather than a reflection of the climate that they're in, and that's why they were far more increasingly diagnosed with schizophrenia, which was associated with violence at the time. And finally, the actual last example I can give is actually from an Israeli psychologist. His name is Baron, and I was writing up a little bit about his work. And it's interesting that he made the point. He's a very famous Israeli psychologist, probably one of the biggest Israeli psychologists. And he wrote a really interesting article once, before his passing, he wrote about 25 years ago. And he was asking, why aren't there sort of psychologists who are like critical of the state of Israel, right? He's like, look, there's sociologists who are critical of the state. There's historians, there's all these professions. Why not psychologists? And his conclusion was, he had different points of his conclusion. One was that psychology, at least especially in Israel, but I think is actually true probably in many places, was very close to the military. So the profession itself is very close to the statecraft and the military. But his other point is that it's this individualizing impulse. Psychology has this very conservative outlook towards the individual has to kind of improve upon themselves, right? And we are out to help individuals. And that's a very conservative, very sort of individualizing way of looking at what is ostensibly social issues. I apologize for talking for a long time, yeah. So I'll try to cut my answers a little bit shorter.
No, please don't. Thanks, Tarek. Some great questions. I'm just struggling to think which one. Oh, I see Rufus is holding up.
One of my favorite books.
There's a question here around wondering, when in various different kind of public service systems, what you've noticed that helps to move teams and colleagues away from politicizing impulse. So there's a question about what, if you have any suggestions around managing fragility that might arise when challenges are made.
That's a really good question. I mean, I think there's a tension here, right? And I'm going to make the tension very explicit. One of the reasons I don't like going down this path is because it responsibilizes often teams and staff for policies and structures, right? So if there's a racist policy that's embedded, let's say within the NHS, like hostile environment policies for checking potentially for undocumented migrants receiving help in the NHS when, quote unquote, they shouldn't. These sort of policies, when they're embedded in the NHS, I don't want to responsibilize staff to not, to not do it, right? It speaks towards us localizing the issue eventually in the staff, making wrong choices at wrong times, or at right times even, rather than actually focusing on the policies themselves, like the prevent policy. And I think that's why, for me, as a matter of fact, when I'm thinking about institutional racism, I don't like training teams. I like to make it about the structures, the space that we all inhabit. The reason why, one main reason why I myself and I draw on many giants and scholars who talk this way. The reason why we say this is because You know what's interesting, like from the examples I've seen with Prevent, for example, is that many people have admitted to me that they don't want to do a Prevent referral, right? Like they don't want to engage down that logic, but they had to, and they felt that compulsion at certain times where they suddenly felt that threat, like to professional autonomy in some way, shape, or form. They felt like, oh, what if I don't make a referral right now, right? Because the policy exists. So what if I take a certain note and then that comes back to me in the future that I didn't write the note in the correct way? You see, like the problem with policies is that we can train staff as much as we want, but ultimately the space, it's literally the walls, the air, the institution itself will create, there'll be certain dynamics that will put people in really precarious situations where they eventually have to act on the policies that they're embedded within. Now, I do think maybe one answer I do give to this is to create these sort of spaces. I put that with a footnote. I put this with a footnote, but to create spaces where staff can feel, safe to be able to share their thoughts on particular policies or particular issues that are happening. I put that with a footnote that I don't know if those spaces can really be embedded within the NHS or within the teams that they operate. It might be a sort of space that could happen without, like, or outside of that, because from my talking with many staff over the years, they just simply won't feel comfortable knowing that the policy still exists, even in the support space. So that's just one way of thinking through. And I think many people have done that with Palestine, for example, is I think many mental health professionals have sought spaces outside of their institutions to be able to think through, okay, how do we mobilize? How do we find support for this? And that might be, I think, essentially one of the better way forwards.
Tarek, thanks very much for what you're sharing, thoughts, learnings, stories. The only problem with the camera is I can't see your wonderful beard. That's cutting off, and I feel like it's relevant in what we're talking about.
That's, I mean, I don't even know why I'm still here. If that's the case, I definitely have to fix that then. I don't know why. So it seems like my camera probably did log in or something like. Sorry, zoom in. I'm assuming.
So you can see you to here, sort of thing. And
okay, yeah.
And then sometimes when you lean forward, it's like this. So
okay.
What?
I'll go. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
I noticed Laura had her hand up. Is that possible that Laura can ask her question? Or is that possible, Sherry?
Actually, it was a mistake. I can't get to the questions. I was trying to, because for some reason, my chat is disabled. So I'd quite like to see all the questions, if that's okay.
All right. Yeah, they are.
Thank you. Thank you for noticing. You're observant.
Right. Yeah, we can only see the questions. We can look at that for future webinars. I'm kind of interested in the not training mental health professionals, but at the same time, I guess you're saying we should come together and support each other where we're passionate about this. So perhaps it's something we need to organize ourselves rather than, are you sort of reluctant to come in as the kind of outside person who sort of educates people?
I think I follow in maybe certain anti-racist traditions who've documented the long history of that being sort of our main approach to issues of racism, right? So we always inevitably fall back onto questions or practices of training, and or obviously diversity, politics, etc. And I think there is relevance to these things. my point isn't to at all critique anyone who does that or who appreciates it. I think that's all very relevant. My point is simply for us to also maybe just, I think as psychologists or mental health professionals, we need to start politicizing our understanding of racism a little bit more, understanding how racialization operates, how policies and politics legitimize certain ways in which groups are racialized, and how, that ends up impacting our practice. And I think without an understanding of that, we can't really mobilize towards the top rather than responsibilizing ourselves as staff. I think that's also particularly relevant in increasing neoliberal times. We know the British Psychological Society did a survey for psychologists in 2015. I think it was for IAPT psychologists or therapists, but they found that enormous numbers of therapists are depressed. They feel like they're constantly bandaging a cost of living crisis, for example, right? Many of them feel like their work is ineffective given increasing issues of austerity, right? So the question I think we have to also ask ourselves sometimes as psychologists is like, what is our political function in a society where, it's going down a certain direction? What's our function then as mental health professionals in this? I think we might overlook that question sometimes. But I think it's increasingly important for us to take that very, very seriously.
Yeah, thanks. Somebody's written here, I work for a training course. I feel rather conflicted that we have to follow university communication around the Palestine-Israel conflict, even after multiple trainees are asking to have more course communication about this. The reason for following university communication is to make sure, in quotes, to make sure we foster a safe learning environment for all, end quotes. I feel like I've inadvertently become part of the institutionalized machine of racism. What might be a useful way of responding to this?
Well, that is a golden question, I think, for all of us right now. I really have to be adamant that I think generally it's bad advice to respond to anything individually. But I want to say this is sort of a larger structural issue that we're seeing across the spectrum, across institutions, etc. So it's not only education. And I don't have an answer to that. I really sincerely don't have an answer. Unfortunately, as we know, the UK, if anything, we just discovered today is actually training Israeli soldiers, or I forgot, like military personnel, supplies to Israel with weapons. There's a lot of politics here that are quite significant. And so I think what we're seeing is a symptom of a wider issue, which is highly problematic, given obviously the following of ICJ's agreement that Israel is committing genocide. I think the only thing that I can offer for us is that we need to collectivize. And I think there are groups that are starting to take, and people who are taking this more seriously. Part of my research right now is actually, I'd be really happy for you to reach out to me personally to share with me your experiences. I want to start documenting this. I think we tend to think of the mental health professions and institutions as being very apolitical. But for example, Royal College of Psychiatrists and British Psychological Society, we're adamant to take two-sided approach right now to Israel and Palestine. But with Russia, obviously, as we know, we're very, very clearly one-sided. So much so, many, I was speaking to a Danish group. In Denmark, the Danish Psychological Society, in fact, we're sending psychologists to Ukraine, and we're recruiting psychologists to go to Ukraine to support the efforts there. you know, there's something here that we need to be able to document and to be able to mobilize on, so people don't feel like they're carrying the weight on their shoulders alone. And I'd be very happy to support you and think through what we could do there.
Thank you, Tarek. Just,
Yeah.
I just wanted to echo what everyone else has been saying. So thank you for a really powerful and, inspiring talk. And a few people have also been saying thank you to you, just so you know, in the chat. Just wanted to share. So someone's asked, can you share the authors again for references? I think they want to catch all the names. I don't know how best to do that.
Oh, I don't know what names of authors I was saying. I probably was saying quite a few, so I apologize. I'll think about that. There's some fantastic books I think about, like colorblindness and racism. One book I think I'd like to often share is called The New Jim Crow. So it talks about how the mass incarceration of Black youth under colorblindness. So, you know, Black youth are far more incarcerated in the United States now than they ever were. And it's not like police officers are told to go out and look for Black youth. So there's a lot of like works and writings on colorblindness and institutional racism, which I think we can read on. And I think I mentioned Wretched of the Earth, which Rufus raised. So yes, that's a fantastic book, which I think everyone can read. There's my book as well. So I'm sure I can send out a list or something if I can remember.
Great. And I know we have a question from Sarah, but before we go to that, I just wanted to share a reflection from Alison. Said that this is a really rich space and they appreciate us organizing it. It makes me wonder how thin and deficient the narratives around anti-racism currently are in the NHS, and how much work we have yet to do together to raise consciousness, carve out a more politicized language when we engage in our practices, and render visible how institutional racism plays out within our services and work. And shouldering each other up in this is so important. Yeah. I think you're on mute, Tarek.
Oh, sorry, I was just agreeing. I just want to say absolutely. I completely agree with that. And of course, I think there's a lot of different forms of how that operates. I'll just quickly mention, we know, for example, that racialized Black the racialized Black community are much more likely to be sectioned, as we know, by police and by judges than they are by NHS staff compared to racialized white community here in the UK. So there's a lot of ways in which the process of racialization operates, and I think for us to understand that, we'll have I think one thing I really want to mention is that we'll actually see a lot of overlap in terms of racialization. The process of racialization, we'll see, if we stop thinking about like, oh, this is the experience of like Muslims, this is the experience of like, the Black community, I think we create these artificial divisions. But if we begin to actually understand the process of racialization, we'll see a lot of overlap in how groups are securitized, deemed violent, different policies, overlap, let's say, between counterterrorism policies and the gang matrix in London. There's a lot of overlap in how these logics operate. And I think we have to take these a lot more seriously for actual coherent solidarity between this.
I don't think we'll get an opportunity to answer all the questions in the Q&A. We'll try our best. We're going to go to Sarah for a question.
Thank you. Yeah, it's easier for me to speak it because it's a little complicated, trying to find a way to articulate. Thank you so much for your work, Tarek. I was actually at Downing Street, so I was a little late, so I'm going to have to catch up on the presentation, but I've lived it. I wanted to speak about the difficulty of the whole of the profession of both psychiatry and psychology in this country missing the understanding of the root of that word, which is actually soul, not mind or body. And so this difficulty of mind-body splits, in which our communities from other parts of majority world heritages do not articulate in ways that self-separate so much, which then gets misunderstood, it gets pathologized, it gets often criminalized, actually, when actually quite often, as you did articulate, I did catch you speaking about distress as a term that, you know, because actually, and in my own experience as someone who is a very creative person, who had a successful career in that, and whose creativity was pathologized, whose self-healing ability was pathologized, whose intellectual gifts and community like way of being was pathologized by a very violent system to people like me. And yet I speak out about this, and doing it alone is almost impossible because you're crushed and crushed and crushed and crushed, and it is systemic. When you call it systemic to the system, it's tokenized, and they come back to you with a token initiative that is under-resourced, where those of us that live it are consistently in our spare time with all of our extra emotional and other types of labor, pouring into something that we know will benefit everyone, and yet the work is not being done by those who don't want to look in the mirror. And it's, so I don't know how to articulate the question, but there's something about that idea of a safe learning environment for all not actually being possible in an institution, because the root of the word institution is an organization founded for a religious, educational, professional, or social purpose. And when the purpose is at its root exclusive and hierarchical and operating in a system that profits from dis-ease and has been actively dismantling collectives, unions, public gatherings to speak out, how do we actually, you know, it's like, how do, you know, this idea of big society back in the day was supposed to bring things back into community, but I've experienced prevent from multiple different, so I don't know, there's so much to talk about, but I don't know, I just want to drop that there. You might have something to say back to me. Would love to spend more time talking with you and you know, making these changes ripple, because they're really needed, and they're really needed also by colleagues who don't know how to look in the mirror properly and aren't seeing the violence that they're unconsciously often inflicting on those of us who see with a totality, because we've had all spectrums of what it is, experience of what it is to be human, and that includes the violence that can be inflicted, not just the comfort. So yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. I just want to maybe just quickly also thank you for you know, going to Downing Street, especially on my behalf as well. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it down today, so I just wanted to thank you for that, especially as well.
For sure, for all of us.
Yeah, I think your last point is also very interesting. I mean, obviously, I think there's a whole element of Eurocentrism in our understanding of everything about healing, illness, and this is something that we've known for a long time. But, you know, I think what's really interesting to me is how difficult, I think, the difficulty institutions have in both grasping that, but also how that is instrumentalized against Muslims. So as I introduced, and maybe you didn't hear me in the beginning, but, you know, the vast majority, if not all my cases, are people who've experienced intense state violence here in the UK or elsewhere, police violence, prison violence, etc. And I've noticed among racialized Muslim prisoners, you know, there's a very distinct form of violence of being strip searched. And I had one client the prison guards were entering his cell every day, every night, for months, every single night, strip searching him, taking all his clothes off for months. And the abuse here is very significant because for him, already the element of nudity, you know, without being touched, was already a form of violence that speaks to a different element of physicality, a different element of bodily boundaries, right? Which for him as a racialized Muslim was very, very important. And we can see how that was very particularly instrumentalized in a way that the staff can say, well, I didn't actually touch you, right? Like I didn't actually physically abuse you, right? And so technically, because all the structures and institutional policies and boundary making was built on a Eurocentric framework of what the boundaries of the body is, you know, it was difficult to be able to make a claim. He did eventually actually make a claim because it's obviously so apparent that they're doing it at midnight, and he won. But you know, that's just one example of many that I know of, which just goes to show how I think institutional policies and structures tend to immediately protect certain ways of understanding our subjectivity, our humanity, our sense of anger, right? Who's allowed to be angry? Who's allowed to express anger? You know, I'm just adding to your point. I think it's really, really important. And obviously, we hopefully find spaces to be able to mobilize on this outside of the institutions if we can as well.
Thank you.
That's, oh no, button. The colorblindness title, was it Colorblindness and Racism, the book you mentioned, Tarek? You're muted again.
You think I would get better at that? The one on colorblindness is the one that kind of inspired my understanding. There's two books. One is called Racism Without Racists. I'll just write it out in the chat. That's actually often a highly cited book in this discussion. Sorry, I'm just pulling out the chat. There it is.
You make it.
So one is called
everyone. Yeah.
Yes, Racism Without Racists. The other one was called The New Jim Crow. They're both American books. Yeah. There are other books that speak towards colorblindness. In fact, there was an anthology, I think, that was written on colorblindness and psychology. It was also American, I think. I mean, I think there's certainly many scholars and many giants who've written about sort of the process of racialization here in the UK. Stuart Hall, as I gave the example of. You know, so I think there's a lot for us to be able to draw upon, and I'm happy if anyone wants references or resources, you can contact me, and I'm happy to share anything that I know.
What would quite a lot of people have asked how they might contact you, Tarek. What would be the best way of doing that, please?
Yeah, you could definitely do that by email. I think the last slide had my university email, but I don't mind people contacting me by my my public email, so to speak. So I'll just put that here, and I'm very happy for anyone to contact me through this.
Your inbox might be soon overwhelmed.
I hope not, but you know, I hope people can also be patient in case it takes a long time for me to respond. Other than that, I always think of myself and my work as, and again, it's really important to say that I know people are seeing me right now, but I really am standing on the shoulders of many giants, many people who've been working in this for a long time. I mean, I know and follow people who've been working on racism in mental health and psychology here for decades. We know, for example, individuals like Suman Fernando. Suman Fernando wrote the book about institutional racism in psychology and psychiatry, which I can also recommend. And there's many others. And these are people that I've looked up to, that I can encourage you to follow as well. There's also a lot of great works looking at Frantz Fanon's thoughts in the current mental health context, and that's something to encourage as well. So, yeah, if I get a question or a comment that I can't address, I'm comfortable in being able to like think through, okay, where can we help you find where that answer may lie.
Thank you for speaking with such authenticity and honesty. That's really admirable. I think sometimes we can get into positions of having or trying to find answers to things or questions. But yeah, that's really humble of you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'll just mention, by the way, there's a number of groups I can also recommend. One is the UK, for Palestine, there's UK Palestine Mental Health Network. Also, you can follow Healing Justice London on Twitter and social media. Healing Justice London is takes these things very seriously, and we had a whole festival with many different panels and events dedicated to, among other things, racism in mental health, but also if we think about housing, we think about how all these themes intersect. I'm very proud to be part of this team. So you can follow their work as well, and I'll be publishing my work through Healing Justice London too.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tarek. Been looking forward to this webinar, and for me, it's like got me thinking more about Islamophobia. I remember I wrote something back after with a colleague, a Muslim colleague, we wrote in a Nursing Times about how Islam was being portrayed in the media after September the 11th, and how that was impacting in our mental health teams, for service users, and for and how then there were jokes in the team that weren't very sensitive, and how we were getting influenced really by the media to sort of a certain type of portrayal of Islam, yeah, so that's been really helpful. And for me, hearing more about institutional racism as a concept, I feel like I was always disappointed that when the Stephen Lawrence inquiry came out, and that was really much more embraced in the police system. I'm sure there are problems with it, but at least there was an acknowledgement. But in the mental health system, it was kind of not thought of as a relevant concept. And I think it is a very relevant concept, and how we can look at these structures and look at things like prevent, and this thing you're talking about as well, this sort of depoliticization, that happens both in psychology, but also in the NHS amongst mental health professionals. This idea of trying to be the subjective scientist practitioner, that perhaps then we don't know where to put values, and we don't know where that perhaps bring up power relationships. and have respectful conversations about those, and but also, you know, talk about our feelings about what's going on. So yeah, I really enjoyed this, and it's got me some reading to go and do, as I'm sure lots of us are going to be doing, and hopefully we can stay in touch, and maybe get you to come to the conference sometime, 1 year anyway. You're free.
I'd be really happy to stay in touch and to always connect with like-minded people. So that's always my privilege as well.
Great. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for all the organizers. You know who you are. Yeah, I won't name everybody, but yeah, thanks a lot, and see you. We should have another webinar coming up in a month's time, looking at making space in supervision for thinking about culture and race. So yeah, would everybody like to say goodbye? And I'll
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Take care. Thank you very much again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We can stop.